Hello and welcome to episode 7 in this Improve Your Chess series. How do you play better chess? So that's the topic for today. There's many ways to improve your chess, but chess is hard. There's different things you can do. Studying tactics is good, but also going over your games and games of other players, especially masters. But today I'm continuing in this series where I'm playing against a good friend of mine, John, and he's improving. In this game, let's take a look at it. It started with d4 and then knight to f6. So I'll go over this game and just see what we can learn about it to help you play better chess. So d4, a good solid opening move, and if you like to attack, you probably want to play e4. d4 is a little more strategic, but either way, games can be strategic or tactical depending on how you follow up. Another reason that chess can be hard. So how can you play better? Well, definitely start out by controlling the center of the board. That will definitely help you on your path to playing better. And how do you control the center of the board? Well, you place pieces where they can attack and cover these strong central squares in the middle of the board. So, d4, of course, attacks e5. And the piece does not, or the pawn does not control the piece, the square that it's on. So if you're trying to control the center, this d pawn, of course, does not control d4. It just sits there, but it controls e5 by attacking that. And the knight is controlling these light squares in the center. All right, moving on, we have d5 by John. So a good move, fighting for equal space in the center. And another way to play better chess is try to control more space than your opponent. That can give you extra room to maneuver and give your pieces more options on what they can do, whether that's an attack or just defending better. So the game continues with bishop to f4. So I went for this Jabava London opening, which I've been playing lately. And another thing, especially if you're a beginner, you don't want to try and just memorize opening moves. So another way to play better chess is when you're starting out, just pick one move for white, one move for black. So let's say you want to play d4 as your first move for white, or e4 might be a little bit better for beginners because e4 tends to have more tactics. The position opens up, and that's really what you need to learn when you're starting out, is how to improve on your tactics and to see attacks on your opponent and also to defend from attacks. All right, so we're controlling the center with bishop to f4, attacking this square on e5, but also aiming at this c7 pawn in case the knight could jump up here and pile up on this pawn. So John responds with e6. So this is still a book move, and it's not a bad move. Let's see what the computer recommended here. It actually recommended c6, which keeps the knight from jumping up to b5. But after e6, the computer does recommend immediately jumping to b5. But if I do that, there's an option. Well, one, the knight could go here and just protect this pawn. Now that knight would be on the edge. But another possibility is if I jump up to b5, they could check me. That would kind of help me develop this pawn and block, and then they could retreat back and be covering this. So instead, I chose to just keep developing pieces and pawns, and that's another way to play better chess. Instead of trying to attack with just two pieces developed. And beginners make this mistake a lot. I've made this mistake many times before, where you have some of your pieces developed, but not all of them, and you don't even have your king castled, and you become impatient and you want to just attack right away. But sometimes, I would say the majority of the time, it's better to hold back and just keep developing all your pieces off the back rank, because chess is kind of like a battle where you don't want to just send a part of your army, half of your army or less even, against your opponent's entire army, or that's just asking for trouble. You don't want to just storm in with two pieces against the entire army of your opponent. So another way to play better chess is just keep developing all your pieces. So moving on, we have e3 here, which it controls and fortifies this d4 pawn on the d4 square, and it lets this bishop come out and develop. Another thing to do is make sure or try to move pieces where they accomplish more than one thing. Now, that might not always be possible, but here, this pawn move, it does a few things. It controls the center. It reinforces this pawn here. It allows this bishop to develop, which could get me closer to castling my king to safety. And that's another thing to do, is castle early and often is a good saying. So castle, quickly so you can get your king into safety. And you think, well, won't my king be trapped in the corner by castling over there? Well, imagine if you leave your king in the center, it can be attacked from head on, from the right or the left. But once you castle, let's say you castle king side over here, it can only be attacked head on or from the left. Nothing can come from off on the side of the board to the right here. All right, moving on, we have bishop to d6. Now, this looks like a good move, developing and attacking this bishop here, but the computer says that's an inaccuracy. The computer recommends moving to b4 here, and it says that black would have a edge after that. So bishop to b4 would pin this knight, but I wouldn't worry about that, because if the knight is captured, black would give up the bishop pair, and you could recapture with this pawn, and then that pawn would be pulled towards the center and fortify this central pawn even more. So another way to play better chess is when you can capture, if you have an option between capturing away from the center or towards the center with your pawns, it's almost always good to capture towards the center, but you do have to just take a second to look and weigh what would be better, if not in this position, but if in a position you can capture away from the center or towards the center. Usually it's good to capture towards the center, but sometimes there are exceptions to all these rules, and these are just general guidelines to help you. All right, this move looks good. The bishops are attacking each other. Now, I could go ahead and capture here, but that would just help either develop a queen, or he could capture with his bishop towards the center, kind of fortifying the center a little bit. It would double his pawns in the center. So, that is something you would have to figure out. What would be best? The computer recommends if I capture that the pawn captures towards the center, helping fortify this central structure. Fortify this central position for black. All right. Now, another interesting saying, to take is a mistake. So usually it's better to ignore your opponent's plans unless they're directly causing an attack on your king, or that you could lose material. But here, if they capture, we would just recapture, and now our pawn would capture away from the center, but it still would be controlling this e5 square. And this is an important dark square in the Jabava London. A lot of times there's a fight in the Jabava London for these dark squares in the center of the board. And with a pawn on f4, even though these pawns would be doubled, it would kind of help guard the king side a little bit more if you decide to castle there. And it would also really help lock down this e5 square, which maybe a knight could jump to in the future, or even the bishop. But let's see how the game continues. So we have d3, developing and controlling a central square. And now the knight is developed. Computer says this is a good move, but now it does recommend that we capture here. But this is good because it develops a knight. The only thing I would say is that it kind of blocks in this c pawn. And a lot of times the c pawn, you want to move that forward. Now I've done the same here, but this knight could move here to e2 in the future possibly, if it doesn't jump forward. Or even to a4, and then the c pawn would be free to move later. But as I said, develop your pieces quickly. So we play knight to f3, the best move, helping control these dark squares in the center. And now h6. So another way to play better chess is be careful about too many pawn moves, especially if they're not in the center. Now, if you're moving central pawns, the D and the E pawn, or even the C pawn a lot of times, that helps control the center. Now, this move is probably kind of a wasted move. The computer still says it's an excellent move because it prevents the knight from jumping forward or the bishop pinning the knight, which I'm not really planning to do that anyway. But there is a threat here of g5. So the computer recommends immediately dropping the bishop back here. And then once again, if it's captured, we can capture towards the center, opening up this h-file for a rook possibly. So instead, I waste a move. Now, here I shouldn't have done that. I was kind of waiting to see what my opponent's plans would be, if he would castle or continue developing and try and castle on the queen side. So this was kind of a waiting move, but still it was a little bit wasted. And maybe I should have, if I was going to move this pawn, I should have maybe played h4. That way, he can't continue here, or I would just grab his pawn, and once again, if he tries to capture, he can't because the rook would capture his rook. Anyway, another thing to watch, too many pawn moves. So you can play better chess by developing your pieces quickly and kind of holding off on too many pawn moves. But as always, and this is why chess is hard, one of the reasons you have to do a little bit of calculation. Almost after every move, you have to reevaluate the position and see what has changed. So after every move your opponent makes, ask yourself, why did my opponent make that move? There may not be any deep reason behind it, or there may be a hidden trap. So, double check. So here, like this move, why did my opponent do that? Well, he probably wanted to wreck my pawns and double them here, break them apart, or he just wanted to trade down material. Another mistake that beginners make is taking too often. Remember, to take is a mistake. Usually it's better to ignore a capture like this and instead just keep developing pieces. So of course I recapture, and the computer of course says this is best. But it really locks down this e5 square where I could jump a knight in here. And if they capture, my pawns will be fixed after I recapture, gaining space and chasing his knight away. So we have another wasted pawn move here with a6. Now, that does keep my knight from jumping forward, or my bishop, but what would that accomplish? Instead, I should be developing pieces, but I play another wasting move here. One, to keep his knight from harassing my bishop, which wouldn't be so bad. If he did that, I could just retreat the bishop and then chase that knight away. But I decided to preemptively stop any forward knight movement and wait to see what my opponent is doing. So we have queen to d6. And in the Jabava London, I had an opponent ask me, why is it better to put this knight on c3 as opposed to d2 in the regular London system opening? Well, maybe one is not necessarily really better than the other, but here the knight's a little more active. It controls the center a little better, but it does block the c-pawn. And they asked, what would you do with the knight once it's here? Where does it go if it can't go to b5? Well, another option is this knight to e2 move, which protects this pawn here, and this one as well, although it's already protected by the other knight. Okay, so my opponent castles, but the computer likes bishop to d7, which holds off on castling and gives you the option to possibly castle queenside, which could be a good idea. So we have c3. I just fortify my central pawn here, and the game continues with rook to e8. So this is the first mistake of the game. Now, why is this a mistake? Well, the computer preferred knight to e7, which, if we take a look at that, knight to e7 would get out of the way of the c-pawn and allow that pawn to push forward and counterattack the center here. Because, what is your other option? You can't push this pawn because of the two dark squared pawns here locking down this e5 square, unless you decide to push f6 first maybe, and then push the e-pawn, but that would weaken squares around your castled king here. So, that's why knight to e7 would be better, to be able to push this pawn forward. Maybe it would help control the king side a little bit, or you could jump here to f5 maybe. But anyway, back to the game. We had rook to e8. Now I see why my opponent does this. He lines this rook up on my king, even though there's a pawn in the way and a knight. Another way to play better chess is to line up pieces on the king or even the queen or unprotected pieces. But here, my opponent lines up on the king with this rook. Even though there's a pawn and a piece in the way, things happen and the position could open up quickly, and then all of a sudden my king is stuck here. So be careful when there's a piece lined up on your king. Now, I thought because I have a good lockdown on this e5 square and this pawn is not really going anywhere, I wasn't worried about this immediately. So I played this, queen to c2, a missed opportunity here. Now, the computer would prefer that I do what? Let's see. After this, it recommends bishop to c2, dropping my bishop back. So, that is an interesting way to go. If I go back here, the computer also recommends g4, immediately pushing forward with a pawn storm and starting to attack. But why would bishop to c2 be a good move? So, let's take a look at that. Bishop to c2, what does that do? Well, it may allow my queen to develop with a bishop-queen battery here, aiming up here at the king side, although this knight is protecting at the moment. But if that knight were to be pushed away, let's say with a pawn storm, pushing forward here up to g5 and chasing that knight away. Then if the queen was up here, maybe we could jump in here and cause some kind of attack on the king. But I missed those chances. Instead, I wanted to get my queen off the back row, line up this way, and my opponent plays a blunder. Now, why is this a blunder? See if you can figure it out. What should I do? You might be able to see the answer here. But this creates weaknesses. So another way to play better chess is watch out when you're pushing pawns in front of your king. Try not to do it unless you have a really good reason. Now, if there was a bishop to jump in here earlier in the game, that may be okay to fianchetto a bishop, which covers the dark squares. But now my opponent has all these dark squared weaknesses around the king. And we have a queen-bishop battery lined up here. My opponent maybe thought he was trying to block my bishop here. But instead, the best move is to capture. And the computer says this is a brilliant move. I don't know if it's brilliant, but it is a good sacrifice here, because if the pawn captures, well, then our queen captures with check. Then we could at least, once that king is forced to move, we pick off the knight and the king is under attack and under check. We could even maybe go after this pawn, jump a knight in, and it's a strong attack. So after this move, my opponent realizes the danger they're in, and instead of falling for the trap and capturing the bishop, they bring their queen up here to help defend. But the computer recommends an immediate knight to e7, which threatens to attack, and it attacks and threatens to capture the bishop. So that might have been a little bit better move, knight to e7, threatening to just take the bishop there. All right, so I just retreat back, the best move. I just come out a pawn ahead here. And now queen to g7. So this is what I mentioned earlier. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces developed, and my opponent only has 3. Never mind. I should say 4, so it's kind of even. But, as far as piece development. But instead of moving this queen again and threatening to capture this pawn, it looks like the best thing to do would be either to move this knight, maybe even develop this bishop, to get this other rook and bishop involved in the game. Or if you move this knight, try and get this pawn moving in the future to counterattack in the center. But instead, a mistake beginners make a lot of times, they'll take a strong attacking piece like the queen, and they'll just try and start attacking something before they get all their pieces developed. So I'm going to go ahead here. Instead of protecting this pawn by pushing it forward or even bringing a rook here, I just ignore this. And now can you see why this queen should not capture this pawn here on g2? And my opponent does not recognize the danger here and goes ahead and snatches this pawn, which is an inaccuracy. I would say this is a mistake or even a blunder. This is probably a blunder move here. Now, why should my opponent not have done that? Because I can just pin this queen to the king here. So a big mistake here by my opponent. Computer recommends instead of that move just playing b5 to try and get some kind of attack going now that I've castled over here. So the rook pins the queen to the king, and now it'll be lost. So Might as well take a piece with you, the best move, take the most valuable piece, but we have a queen for a rook, and now an attack on the king. So the best move is to sidestep to f8, and the king does that. And now the knight jumps up here to e5, a nice outpost attacking black side of the board here, but the knight is captured immediately. But look what happens here. Now we recapture, correcting our doubled pawns, gaining space, and driving this knight away. So the knight moves here to e4, and it looks like knight to g8 would have been an even better move, because here the knight is just captured, and then after the recapture, we gain a pawn from that. So once again, another way to play better chess is to double check and calculate what will happen after you make a move. Don't just immediately jump to a square without doing a little research on what will happen if I jump here. Then what will my opponent do? Well, they may find out that, if I jump here, my knight could be captured. And then if I recapture, then the queen will get a pawn. And they just needlessly give up a pawn and material. Once you're behind in material, you want to avoid as many trades of pieces as you can and just try and trade off all the pawns. Because every pawn on the board could potentially become a queen if it makes it to the other side of the board and is promoted. And if you get rid of all your opponent's pawns, then that's less firepower that they could have at the end of the game. And let's say, for example, if you were just down by a bishop or a knight, and all the pieces and pawns are traded off, and they just have a king and a knight or a king and a bishop at the end versus your lone king, well, then that would just be a draw, and they can't win with those pieces. All right, knight jumps forward, we capture, recapture, and we come out ahead of pawn here. So now we have this move, rook to d8, but once again, it would have been better to develop the bishop, get this other rook involved. And so now the best move, queen to h4, forking the pawn and the unprotected rook here. Now it looks like the best move is to let this pawn fall and move your king, start running with your king, running for its life, and get away from this other side of the board here. They recommend king to e8, but I don't know, that doesn't look good at all, because once the king runs to e8, I mean, it's already a mate now, mate in 15, 7, or 5. But if they ran here, well, then you could just check, and then the king would be forced to move, and then you could just pick off this rook. So, this move is understandable. You develop the bishop finally, and the other rook just protects your rook. But now it's a mate in 4. So we capture here with check, forcing the king to move. And now we check again, and the king drops back. And the game ends here with a threat of mate. So that is stopped with the bishop. But then we just sidestep the rook here to h7 and mate on h8. And it looks like another possibility is to immediately jump this knight up to f4 with the threat of just playing this knight to g6 or capturing, and that would deliver mate because this pawn is pinned by the queen. But we sidestep, and my opponent doesn't have anything they can do. Even if they try and move the bishop, we can still checkmate up here. So this is how the game ended, with a mate. All right. As a quick review, how can you play better chess? Well, don't try, especially if you're a beginner, to just memorize moves and different openings. Just learn general opening principles like controlling the center. So if we go back and look at these first few moves, they're controlling the center squares, these four important squares in the center. So remember to do that. Place your pawns in the center or place pieces so that they are attacking central squares like these knights and now this bishop. And also, to play better chess, develop your pieces as quickly as you can. So we're playing, now sometimes you have to play pawn moves to allow your pieces to develop, like we do here. But then you want to get these pieces developed. And ask yourself what will happen first before you just jump, make a move to a square. Ask yourself, well, is that a good move if I go there? What might happen? What will my opponent do? Well, here I could capture and double his pawns up, but the computer recommends that I just develop the queen here. Instead, I just develop my bishop. So as I said, we're developing quickly. We have both our knights out. Another way to play better chess, usually you want to develop knights before the bishops because the knights are slower. So you want to get them out first, and they're almost always placed on the best squares if you move them to f3 or c3 for white, and then for the black pieces, knight to f6 or, knight to f6 or c6. Because here they control two central squares, and so they're almost always well placed here. Now, you have to calculate a little bit because sometimes there are exceptions to those rules. Now, another reason to hold off on developing your bishops is because that gives you a little bit more time to see where it will be best to place those bishops. And then here, avoid unnecessary pawn moves. Now, this move does give you a little bit of breathing room if the king castles kingside, and it may threaten to play b5 here. So I give my bishop a little escape hatch, but that move was kind of wasted. So don't waste your moves by moving too many pawns, especially before you get all your pieces developed and get your king castled. And another way to play better chess is remember to take is a mistake. Usually you don't want to take here because one, you wasted an opportunity by taking a piece when you could have just developed another piece, like this bishop, or you could have castled. The computer recommends, let's see here, even a little sacrifice of knight takes d4, but that would fight for control of the center. So just remember, to take is usually a mistake. Now, here, they capture, they wasted an opportunity to develop another piece or get castled, and after I recapture, it just helps me control the center, another important central square. Even though this pawn moved off to the side, it opened up the E file. So now I have a half open E file, maybe for a rook to develop up here. And it helped lock down this important E5 square. My knight could jump up there. And as we continue here, finally the queen moves. Remember not to develop your queen too early. A lot of beginners will make that mistake by bringing that queen out too early, and then it could be chased around, and you waste time running away while your opponent is moving forward, attacking, or even developing a piece with an attack. All right, so here, another example or a demonstration of moving a piece twice in the opening. Usually you don't want to do that, but here I'm forced to do that because my opponent developed with an attack and then I had to defend. So that is maybe the idea behind my opponent capturing here. And now he gets to develop with an attack, and I just have to defend by moving a piece twice. So sometimes you have to move a piece twice, but in general, get all your pieces off the back rank, your knights, your bishops, connect your rooks. You don't necessarily have to get your rooks off the back rank, but at least connect them, put them in behind pawns that have moved forward, or place them on half open ranks, files. Anywhere where the rook has a little bit more mobility. So let's continue here. Finally, my opponent castles. I go ahead and fortify the center here. And as I was saying, move the rook where there's a half open file or you've pushed a pawn. Now in this case it's a mistake because there was a better move, repositioning this knight so that black could counterattack with the c pawn in the center here. But moving on, just to give you this quick recap of the game. Finally I developed the queen. The computer doesn't like that so much, but it gets the queen off the back rank. I didn't move it anywhere where it would be in danger, and it's getting me closer to castling. Now I can castle on the queen side or the king side and connect my rooks. So the game continued with the blunder here. A way to play better chess: look for tactics. Do regular tactics problems and be on the lookout for tactics like this against your opponent's king. So I capture. They don't want to capture because of the attack here. So the queen defends. And anyway, I'm not going to continue on further for this video, but the last thing I will say is watch out for capturing poisoned pawns. This looks like a pawn that could be captured here, especially after I castle and ignore it. But here I've developed my rook, which was doing nothing here on A1. And after my opponent captures, another tactic, moving the rook to the open file, lining up on the king and queen here, and it's trapped. So after the capture and recapture, now we have an attack, and you saw how that played out. All right. Well, I hope this video helps you some and gives you some ideas of how you can play better chess. Feel free to leave comments at any time. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.